The stench hit me like a physical blow. Rot, stale blood, and something else. Something acrid, like burnt sugar. I gagged, pulling my cheap Carnival mask higher over my nose, hoping to filter some of the foul air. The anonymous man, my unlikely savior, moved with a purpose that belied the chaos around us, his hand clamped tight on my arm. Each step deeper into this festering underbelly of Rio felt like a descent into hell itself. Above, the distant pulse of the samba drums was a mocking counterpoint to the creeping dread that coiled tighter with every breath. He stopped abruptly, his grip tightening until my bones ached. We were in a narrow alleyway, choked with overflowing bins and the shadows of unseen things. A feral cat, ribs showing, glared at us from atop a garbage heap, its eyes gleaming like twin embers. The man pointed to a doorway, barely visible in the gloom. It was a crude opening in a crumbling brick wall, sealed with a rusted metal door. "In here," he rasped, his voice low and urgent. "They won't expect us to double back." I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But Sarah was in there, somewhere, and I couldn't abandon her. Not again. I nodded, steeling myself. Whatever awaited us on the other side of that door couldn't be any worse than the alternative, becoming a permanent resident of this nightmare. He produced a slim silver tool from his pocket. A lockpick, I realized with a jolt. I hadn't even considered the possibility that he was a criminal. But then again, what was I expecting? A saint? He worked quickly, his movements precise and practiced. A soft click echoed in the oppressive silence, and he pushed the door open. Darkness. Absolute, impenetrable darkness. The stench was even worse here, clinging to the back of my throat like a shroud. I fumbled for my phone, praying for even a sliver of battery life. Nothing. Dead as a doornail. "Stay close," the man whispered, his voice barely audible. "And whatever you do, don't make a sound." He moved forward, disappearing into the blackness. I followed blindly, my hand outstretched, clinging to the back of his shirt like a lifeline. The air grew colder, the silence heavier. I could feel the presence of something else, something ancient and malevolent, pressing in on us from all sides. Then, a flicker, a single point of light in the distance, growing slowly larger. We moved towards it, inching forward through the darkness. As we drew closer, the light revealed a vast, cavernous space. A warehouse, perhaps? Or something older. Something subterranean. And in the center of the space, a figure. Tall, impeccably dressed, bathed in the ethereal glow of a single flickering gas lamp. The obsidian-eyed man. He was waiting for us, and beside him, chained to a stone pillar, was Sarah. Her eyes were wide with terror. Her mouth was gagged, and around her neck, glistening in the lamplight, was a silver collar. He raised a hand, a slow, deliberate gesture, and smiled. It was a smile that promised pain, a smile that tasted of death. My pulse hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the oppressive silence of that subterranean chamber. Sarah, seeing her like that, chained, terrified, it ripped a hole in the fragile bubble of denial I'd been clinging to since the caipirinha haze lifted. This wasn't some drunken misadventure. This was something far darker, something ancient and hungry, the kind of thing that whispered in the spaces between sanity and madness. The silver collar, that detail stuck in my craw like a splinter. Cold, gleaming, and undeniably possessive. A brand. He wanted to own her. The obsidian-eyed man. He radiated an aura of predatory calm that was more terrifying than any raging beast. He knew he had us cornered. He reveled in it. The air hung thick with the metallic tang of blood, mingling with the cloying sweetness of decay. It was a perfume designed to lull you into a false sense of security, right before the teeth sank in. I could feel the weight of his gaze, dissecting me, measuring my worth as a potential meal. Or perhaps something worse. My savior. What was his name? I hadn't even asked. Stood beside me, his face a mask of grim determination. His eyes, Those ancient, knowing eyes flickered over Sarah, then back to the obsidian-eyed man. I could feel the tension radiating off him, a coiled spring ready to unleash. But he remained still, waiting for the opportune moment. Or perhaps, accepting the inevitable. The silence stretched, taut, and suffocating. The only sound was Sarah's muffled whimpers, a desperate plea lost in the vastness of the chamber. I had to do something. Anything. But what? I was a chartered accountant, not a bloody action hero. My skills lay in spreadsheets and tax returns, not battling supernatural entities in the bowels of Rio. Sarah. God, Sarah. That reckless, impulsive, infuriating woman. She dragged me into this mess, yes, but she was also the only person who had ever truly seen me. The only one who had chipped away at the rigid shell I'd built around myself. I couldn't let him take her. I took a step forward, my legs trembling. Let her go. I managed to croak, my voice thin and reedy in the oppressive atmosphere. It sounded pathetic even to my own ears. The obsidian-eyed man chuckled, a low guttural sound that sent shivers down my spine. "You presume to bargain with me, little accountant?" he said, his voice smooth as silk yet sharp as a razor. "You have nothing I desire." His gaze flicked to my companion. "Except, perhaps." He paused, his eyes narrowing. A familiar face, one I thought long departed. My savior tensed, his hand twitching towards the stake hidden beneath his shirt. The air crackled with unspoken menace. This wasn't just about Sarah. There was history here, a deep-seated animosity that ran far deeper than I could possibly comprehend. The obsidian-eyed man smiled, a predatory grin that revealed teeth a shade too long, a shade too sharp. "But sentimentality is a weakness," he purred, "and I have long since purged myself of such trivialities." He snapped his fingers. From the shadows, figures emerged. Tall, pale, and impossibly graceful. The women I'd seen at the parade. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural hunger, their smiles promising pain and oblivion. They moved with a fluid, almost ethereal grace, gliding towards us like shadows come to life. I knew with a chilling certainty that this was it, the end. I'd come to Rio for sun, sand, and samba. Instead, I'd found myself in a nightmare beyond comprehension, facing a fate far worse than death. But even as despair threatened to consume me, a flicker of defiance ignited within. I might be a chartered accountant, but I was also Sarah's friend, and I wasn't going to let her face this alone. I balled my fists, ready to fight, ready to die. The drums, those damned samba drums, pulsed in my head, a relentless, mocking rhythm accompanying our descent into darkness. The drumming intensified, a tribal tattoo hammered onto the inside of my skull. Each beat was a nail, driving me further into the suffocating throng. It wasn't just noise. It was a physical pressure, a psychic weight threatening to buckle my knees. Sweat plastered my shirt to my back, a clammy second skin. The perfume, once intoxicating, now reeked of decay, mingling with a coppery tang that sent a jolt of primal fear through my veins. Blood. The air tasted like blood. I lurched forward, desperate to escape the claustrophobic crush, my hand flailing for purchase, my fingers snagged on the cold, unforgiving metal of a barricade, saving me from a messy tumble. As I straightened, I caught a glimpse through the chaotic swirl of bodies and garish floats. A shadow, lurking just beyond the reach of the neon glare. He was there, the man with the obsidian eyes, closer than before. The air around him seemed to ripple, distorting the images behind him, like heat rising off asphalt on a summer day. And he wasn't alone. Two women flanked him, their beauty unsettling, alien. Their skin possessed an unnatural pallor, almost translucent, as if lit from within by some malevolent force. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, held a luminescence that wasn't human, the cold, unwavering glow of predatory stars. And their smiles, those smiles were wrong. Too wide, too perfect. The smiles of things that hunted in the dark. They moved with a fluid grace that defied physics, gliding through the throng as if weightless, immaterial. The crowd parted before them, not with intention, but with an unconscious yielding, like seaweed swaying in the current. Nobody seemed to notice them, or perhaps they saw them and chose not to acknowledge what their instincts screamed was wrong. The man raised his hand, a slow, deliberate motion, the gesture of a conductor summoning his orchestra. A silent command, and the women obeyed. They separated, melting into the throng like smoke, their movements swift and silent. Hunting. The drums beat faster, harder, echoing the frantic rhythm of my own heart. This wasn't a bad trip. This wasn't some boozy hallucination conjured by too many caipirinhas and not enough sleep. This was real, bone-chillingly, gut-wrenchingly real, and I was smack dab in the middle of it. Panic clawed at my throat, choking off my breath. I had to get out. Now. Before they what? The thought wouldn't fully form, but the feeling was there. A cold dread that settled deep in my bones. I turned to run, to lose myself in the chaotic swirl of the parade, but it was too late. One of them was already there, standing directly in my path. Her face was inches from mine, her eyes locked onto mine. A strange hypnotic pull emanated from those eyes, drawing me in, erasing everything else. In that moment, suspended between terror and morbid fascination, I knew I was trapped. A fly caught in a spider's web. The drums hammered on, an impending doom. The hunger in her eyes wasn't just the kind you saw in the favelas, the gnawing emptiness of poverty. This was something else. Something primal. Something that went back further than humanity itself. It was the hunger of a predator, pure and unadulterated. It made my stomach churn, a cold knot of dread forming beneath my ribs. I tried to backpedal, but the crowd was a living wall, pressing in on all sides, the stench of sweat and cheap perfume suddenly suffocating. It was like being buried alive in a pile of sequins and desperation. Help? I managed, the word a pathetic squeak lost in the cacophony of the samba drums. It felt ridiculous, begging for mercy from something that clearly wasn't human. Her smile widened, revealing teeth that were just a little too long, a little too sharp. Pearly white, yet somehow wrong, like polished bone. "Oh, we're very helpful," she purred, her voice a silken caress that did nothing to soothe the terror clawing at my insides. "We just want to share the spirit of Carnival." Share the spirit? Right. The spirit of being drained dry in a back alley, maybe. My gaze darted around, searching for an escape, a crack in the human dam. But they were everywhere. The women, their eyes like chips of ice, reflecting the neon lights, their movements too smooth, too graceful. The man, always just out of reach. A silent puppeteer orchestrating this nightmare. The obsidian eyes watched, unwavering, knowing. I was a lab rat in a maze of flesh and feathers, and they were patiently waiting for me to stumble into the trap. Sarah died. God, Sarah. Where was she? What had they done to her? The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through me, overriding the paralyzing fear. I had to find her. I couldn't let them. Let them what? The horror was shapeless, formless, but its presence was undeniable. It was in the air, in the eyes of the women, in the obsidian gaze of the man. It was in the ancient stories Sarah had scoffed at, the tales of creatures that haunted the fringes of Rio, preying on the unwary. The lobisomum, the kuka, the chupa-chupa, that doll, the bloodsucker. I shook my head, trying to dislodge the image, the sheer absurdity of it. Vampires? Really? It was the 21st century, not some goddamn gothic novel. But the woman's eyes. They held a truth that couldn't be denied, a hunger that went beyond mere sustenance, a thirst for something more. She tilted her head, her smile never wavering. "You're thinking about the stories, aren't you?" She whispered, her voice a hypnotic murmur. "The old legends. They're not just stories, little lamb. They're warnings." A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. How did she know what I was thinking? Was she reading my mind? Or was it something else? Something more sinister? I had to get away. I had to find Sarah. I had to survive. But how? I was just a bloody accountant from Melbourne, armed with nothing but a rapidly diminishing supply of courage and a growing sense of impending doom. I looked back at the woman. Her eyes were still locked on mine, and in their depths, I saw something that chilled me to the very core. Not just hunger, but amusement. She was enjoying this. She was toying with me. And then, I saw it. A flicker of movement behind her. A shadow detaching itself from the throng. A hand reaching out, not towards me, but towards the woman. A hand holding something small, something silver. Hope, fragile and fleeting, flickered in my chest. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this nightmare. She moved faster than thought. A blur of predatory grace in the chaos. No scream, no theatrical snarl, just raw, unleashed need. A force that hit me like a runaway train. Instinct took over, that primal wiring that bypassed the accountant and screamed survive. I threw up an arm, a pathetic shield against the storm, and then the pain exploded. Not a clean slice, but a ragged, tearing agony as her nails, impossibly sharp, raked across my forearm, like dragging barbed wire through flesh. I stumbled back, a strangled gasp escaping my lips. The air seemed to thin, the samba drums morphing into a distorted, mocking soundtrack. Around us the throng danced on, oblivious, blind. They were cattle, and she was the butcher. She advanced, her eyes burning with a light that had no business in a human face. A cold, incandescent wrongness. It wasn't just hunger, it was triumph. The thrill of the hunt, the certainty of the kill. I knew, with a sickening certainty that burrowed deep into my marrow, that this was it. The end of the line. Melbourne Liam, chartered accountant, about to become a carnival snack. But then, a hand. Not gentle, not reassuring, but a brutal, yanking force that ripped me away from the precipice. I spun around, disoriented, blinking against the strobe lights. A man, tall, like a bloody oak, shoulders that could carry the weight of the world. His face, familiar, yet unsettlingly alien, like a half-remembered dream, or a face seen in a cracked mirror. He wore jeans and a plain white shirt, unremarkable except for the way they clung to his frame, hinting at the power beneath. But it was his eyes. Those were the things that stopped my heart. Ancient, weary, and filled with a sorrow that could drown continents. He didn't speak, didn't offer a reassuring smile or a comforting platitude. He just pulled, a relentless, irresistible force, dragging me through the sea of bodies. The woman hissed, a sound that scraped along my nerves like fingernails on a chalkboard. "Let him go," she shrieked, her voice raw with fury. The sound cut through the music, a primal scream of thwarted hunger. But the man ignored her. He was a lighthouse in the storm, a solid point of sanity in a world gone mad. He plowed through the dancers, his grip like a vise, until we reached the edge of the parade route. Then, he hauled me behind a parked car. A dented Volkswagen Beetle painted in garish carnival colors. I leaned against the cold metal, gasping for breath, my lungs burning, my arm throbbing. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a hollow ache and a bone-deep terror. Who are you?" I stammered, my voice cracking. He looked at me, his eyes filled with that bottomless sadness. "Someone who knows what they are," he said, his voice a low rumble, like distant thunder. "And what they want." He paused, his gaze hardening. "You need to get out of here, now, before it's too late." "Get out," he'd said, like it was that simple. Like escaping a swarm of goddamn locusts or telling cancer to just pack its bags and leave. Easy for him. He wasn't the one bleeding, was he? He wasn't the one with a missing friend and a rapidly unraveling sanity. Sarah. The name felt like a shard of glass in my throat. What about Sarah? He hesitated. A flicker of something unreadable in those ancient eyes. Regret? Pity? Or maybe just the weary resignation of a man who'd seen too much darkness. "She's complicated," he finally said, the word hanging in the humid air like a bad omen. Just focus on saving yourself. Saving myself? What kind of friend did he think I was? No, I said, my voice trembling but firm. I'm not leaving without her. Not again. He sighed, a sound like air leaking from a punctured tire. You're a fool, he said, but there was a grudging respect in his voice. But I admire your loyalty. Fine, I'll help you find her. But you need to listen to me. Do exactly as I say. No questions. No questions? That was going to be a problem. My brain was a goddamn question mark factory right now. But I nodded, swallowing my fear. I didn't have a choice. Sarah was counting on me, even if she didn't know it. He led me away from the pulsating heart of the carnival, into the back alleys of Rio. The music faded, replaced by the unsettling symphony of the city's underbelly. The drip, drip, drip of leaking pipes, the rustle of unseen things in the shadows, the distant wail of a siren. The air grew heavy, thick with the stench of urine, rotting garbage, and something else. A sweet, sickly odor that made my stomach clench. The city felt different here. Not just darker, but tainted. Like a beautiful painting left out in the rain, the colors running together, the canvas rotting from within. We passed crumbling buildings, their walls plastered with layers of graffiti, a chaotic tapestry of gang tags and political slogans. Shadowy figures lurked in doorways, their faces obscured by darkness. Eyes watched us, cold and assessing. I felt like I was walking into a goddamn nightmare, a place where the rules of reality didn't apply. He stopped in front of a dilapidated building, its windows boarded up, its facade scarred with age and neglect. A single flickering bulb cast a sickly yellow light over the entrance, doing little to dispel the gloom. This is where they take them, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The ones they want to keep. Keep? The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken menace. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, a burning sensation in the back of my throat. What do you mean, keep? He didn't answer. He just pushed open the door and led me inside. The building swallowed us whole. Darkness descended, a suffocating blanket that pressed in on all sides. The stench intensified, a putrid mix of decay and despair. It was the smell of death, lingering in the air like a malevolent ghost. The floor was damp and uneven beneath my feet, and I stumbled, grabbing onto his arm for support. He didn't flinch, but his grip tightened, a silent warning. We crept through the corridors, our footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The only other sound was the distant drip, drip, drip of water, a maddeningly persistent rhythm that played on my nerves. I could hear faint sounds in the distance, moans, whispers, screams. They were muffled, distorted, but undeniably human, and undeniably filled with pain. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. Each step forward felt like a betrayal, a descent into a deeper circle of hell. I wanted to turn back, to run screaming into the night, but Sarah was in there, and I couldn't abandon her. We reached a large room, a vast, cavernous space that reeked of despair. The air was thick with a palpable sense of dread, a weight that pressed down on me, stealing my breath. And what I saw inside, I'll never forget it. Not if I live to be 100. The room reeked of desperation, a cloying perfume of fear and decay that masked something far more sinister. Dozens, maybe hundreds, faces, pale as bone china, gaunt with hunger, flickered in the dim light filtering from unseen sources. Men, women, children, all tethered to their nightmare, their life force bleeding away through unseen wounds. They were cattle, pensively grazing in a charnel house. And the shepherds? The damned. Vampires. The word tasted like ash in my mouth, a childhood bogeyman dragged kicking and screaming into a reality too hideous to comprehend. They moved with a languid grace, their eyes burning with a cold, unholy fire. Crimson glints in the shadows like embers in a dying fire. Draining. Always draining. I wanted to scream, to rip them apart with my bare hands, but my feet were rooted to the spot, my throat choked with terror. A primal paralysis. The man, my guide, my reluctant savior. yanked my arm, pulling me deeper into the abyss. "Sarah's here," he rasped, his voice a gravelly whisper against the rising tide of dread. "I can smell her." He smelled her. Christ. But what had this world become? We moved through the throng, a grotesque parody of a dance floor, our eyes scanning the faces, searching for a flicker of recognition, a sign of life amidst the living dead. The air vibrated with a low guttural hum, a symphony of suffering that resonated deep within my bones. And then I saw her, a splash of blonde amidst the pallid faces, a fragile bloom in a field of decay. Sarah Dot, lying on a makeshift cot, her skin as white as fresh snow, her chest barely rising and falling. A vampire loomed over her, a gaunt figure with eyes like chips of obsidian, its fangs bared, ready to feast. A red mist of rage descended, burning away the fear, replacing it with a white-hot fury. "Get away from her!" I bellowed, the sound echoing through the chamber, shattering the morbid silence. The vampire turned, startled, its eyes widening in surprise. For a fleeting moment, it looked almost human. Then the hunger returned, the predatory gleam, and it snarled. I launched myself forward, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate love for my friend. My fist connected with its jaw, a satisfying crunch of bone and cartilage. It staggered back, hissing like a cornered cat, then lunged, its claws extended, its fangs bared. The man moved with a speed I hadn't thought possible, a blur of motion in the dim light. He pulled a wooden stake from beneath his coat, a crude, hand-carved thing that looked like it belonged in a museum. He drove it home, straight through the vampire's heart. A scream, raw and guttural, ripped through the air, followed by a sickening crunch as the creature crumbled to dust. Dust. That's all they were. Monsters made of dust. I rushed to Sarah's side, kneeling beside her, taking her cold hand in mine. "Liam," she whispered, her voice a faint rasp. "Is that you?" "I'm here," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I'm going to get you out of here." I scooped her up in my arms, her body light as a feather. Too light. I started to run, ignoring the protests of my aching muscles, fueled by a desperate hope. But we didn't get far. The vampires were everywhere, a wall of pale faces and burning eyes, blocking our path. They hissed, their fangs bared, their eyes filled with a murderous rage. We were trapped, hemmed in, the flickering light dancing over their faces, turning them into grotesque masks. I knew, with a sinking heart, that it was over, that all the fight, all the adrenaline, all the desperate hope had been for nothing. We were going to die here in this charnel house, surrounded by monsters. Then, a flicker of movement. A figure stepped forward, separating itself from the throng. The obsidian-eyed man. He smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips. "So," he said, his voice smooth as silk, a predatory purr that sent shivers down my spine. "You thought you could escape us?" He was close enough to touch, the stink of death and decay radiating from him like a shroud. My savior, my protector, was nowhere to be seen, and a horrible thought occurred to me. Maybe he'd known. Maybe he'd led me here knowing full well this was the end. This false hope. This glimmer of rescue. All of it. A cruel charade. The obsidian-eyed man's voice, smooth as river stones worn down by centuries of current, dripped with mock sorrow. "So," he said, each syllable a tiny icicle stabbing in my resolve. "You thought you could simply walk away?" I tasted bile. "I'm taking Sarah. This ends now." The words felt hollow, pathetic even to my own ears, like a child trying to argue with a hurricane. He laughed, a sound devoid of humor, a dry rustling noise like leaves skittering across a graveyard. "You presume, little man, you are but a fleeting shadow in a game played out over millennia." He gestured, a languid flick of his wrist, and the vampires surged forward, a tide of pale flesh and ravenous hunger. Their fangs, elongated and wickedly sharp, gleamed in the flickering light like shards of broken glass. The man beside me, the one with eyes that had seen too much and a soul that seemed older than time itself, moved with a speed that defied his weary appearance. Another stake appeared in his hand. A simple piece of wood transformed into a weapon of righteous fury. He was a whirlwind of motion, a dervish of death, but even he was outnumbered. I couldn't just stand there, paralyzed by fear. Sarah needed me. I gently lowered her to the ground, the cold stone floor a stark contrast to her feverish skin. I grabbed the only weapon at hand, a broken chair, its legs splintered, its seat torn. A pathetic defense against creatures of the night, but it was all I had. I swung, putting all my weight behind the blow. The chair connected with a sickening thud against the nearest vampire's head. He staggered, momentarily stunned, his eyes widening in surprise. I swung again, and again, the wood splintering with each impact. He crumpled, a heap of dust and decaying flesh. I turned to face the others, my heart hammering against my ribs, the taste of blood and fear thick in my mouth. They were closing in, their eyes burning with a predatory hunger. I knew I couldn't win, not against these creatures, but I wasn't going to surrender without a fight, not while Sarah drew breath. I charged, a desperate, screaming banshee, swinging the chair with all the force I could muster. The wood connected, shattering against bone, but they kept coming, their hunger insatiable. The obsidian-eyed man watched, a cruel smile twisting his lips. He was enjoying this, the spectacle of my futile resistance. He raised a hand, a gesture of absolute authority, and the vampires froze, their movements arrested mid-stride. "Enough," he said, his voice laced with amusement. "I want him alive. For now." He turned his gaze upon me, a gaze that felt like a physical violation. "You are stronger than I anticipated," he said, his voice a low purr. "But you are still no match for me." He lunged, a blur of motion, his fangs bared, his eyes burning with an ancient malice. I closed my eyes, bracing for the inevitable pain, the tearing of flesh, the draining of my life force. But it never came. Instead, a strange pressure, a searing heat, erupted from my chest, like a volcano erupting within. The world swam back into focus, all fuzzy edges and distorted shapes, like looking through a heat-warped mirror at a funhouse reflection of reality. The sharp, metallic tang of blood still clung to the air, mingling with the underlying stench of rot and decay. But the obsidian-eyed bastard was gone, vanished like a bad dream at the first crack of dawn. And the vamps, they were just gone, like someone had flicked a switch and snuffed them out. My unlikely savior, the man with eyes that held the weight of centuries, stood over me, his face etched with a weariness that seemed to seep into my very bones. He looked like he'd just run a marathon in hell and was already signing up for the sequel. "What happened?" I croaked, my voice raw and shaky. My chest felt like it had been hit with a sledgehammer, a dull, throbbing ache that radiated outwards. "I stopped him," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any triumph. "For now." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken dread. For now. As if this was just a temporary reprieve, a rain delay in the middle of a Category 5 hurricane. He reached down, offering a hand. I took it, and he hauled me to my feet. My legs wobbled, threatening to buckle beneath me. Sarah detrod. I glanced down. She was still out cold, her face pale and drawn, her breathing shallow, like a porcelain doll, beautiful but fragile, teetering on the edge of oblivion. "We need to get her out of here," he said, his gaze sweeping the empty chamber, as if expecting the vampires to reappear at any moment. We carried Sarah out of that godforsaken building, the air growing cleaner, lighter with each step. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting long skeletal shadows across the deserted streets, a sickly golden glow that did little to dispel the lingering darkness. The carnival was over. The party was done. The streets were empty, littered with the detritus of a night of revelry gone horribly wrong. Discarded masks, crumpled confetti, broken bottles. Like a crime scene after the cops had packed up and left. We flagged down a taxi, the driver eyeing us with suspicion, a silent question in his eyes. We told him to take us to the airport, and he gunned the engine, eager to get us out of his cab and out of his life. As we drove away, I looked back at the building. It seemed smaller now, less menacing in the cold light of dawn. But I knew that the evil was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next opportunity, like a festering wound that refused to heal. I looked at Sarah, her face pale and drawn, her body limp in my arms. She was alive, but something had been taken from her, something that could never be replaced. I knew that she would never be the same, and neither would I. The airport was eerily quiet, the usual hustle and bustle replaced by a sense of unease. We checked in for our flight, the clerk giving us a wide berth, as if afraid of catching whatever plague we carried. As we waited to board, I saw him, the man who had helped us, standing in the corner, watching us. He was a shadow in the early morning light, his face obscured by the gloom. I walked over to him, my heart pounding in my chest. "Thank you," I said, the words feeling inadequate. A pathetic attempt to express the gratitude I felt for everything. He nodded, his eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed to stretch back to the dawn of time. "Just be careful," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They're always watching." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. I never saw him again. He was a ghost, a phantom, a figment of my imagination. Or maybe he was something more, something ancient, something powerful, something that walked between the worlds. And maybe, just maybe, he was still out there, fighting the darkness, protecting the innocent. But I knew, deep down, that we were on our own now, that the nightmare had just begun, and that the obsidian-eyed man, and whatever forces he served, would be waiting for us. Always. The contest flight back to Melbourne felt like a fever dream. Sarah slept, fitfully, muttering gibberish in Portuguese. I watched her, the cabin lights painting her face in shades of sickly green and sallow yellow. Every so often, she'd flinch, her eyes snapping open, only to glaze over again moments later. I wondered what she saw in those fleeting moments of consciousness. What horror still danced behind her eyelids. Melbourne welcomed us back with a cold, gray embrace. The sky wept a fine, drizzling rain, mirroring the bleakness I felt inside. The familiar streets seemed different, tainted, as if the darkness we brought back from Rio had seeped into the very foundations of the city. Sarah recovered, physically at least. The cuts on her neck faded, leaving behind faint silvery scars, permanent reminders of what had happened. But the experience had hollowed her out. The spark that had always burned so brightly within her had dimmed, leaving behind a flickering ember of fear. She was quieter now, more withdrawn. She avoided crowds, shied away from loud noises. She never talked about Rio, and neither did I. We tried to bury it, to pretend it never happened, to convince ourselves it was just a bad dream, a drunken hallucination fueled by too much sun and too many caipirinhas. But some things, they refused to stay buried. The memory of the obsidian-eyed man, that predator in a suit, haunted my waking hours. His smile, that slow, deliberate curve of his lips, played on repeat in my mind. The taste of fear, sharp and metallic, lingered on my tongue. The screams in the night, the moans of the damned, echoed in my ears. They invaded my dreams, twisting them into grotesque parodies of reality. One night, months later, I was sitting in my apartment, trying to lose myself in the pages of a book. Sarah was asleep in the next room, or so I thought. The rain hammered against the windows, a relentless drumming that set my teeth on edge. And then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible scratching, like fingernails on glass. I looked up, my heart seizing in my chest, and there he was, standing outside, bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights. The obsidian-eyed man. His face was partially obscured by the rain-streaked glass, but there was no mistaking those eyes. Cold, empty, hungry. He smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips, a promise of pain and suffering. And I knew he had found us. He would always find us. Because some nightmares, they don't just end when you wake up. They linger, they wait, they whisper, and sometimes, when you least expect it, they come back for you. I looked at Sarah, sleeping peacefully in her bed. The moonlight painted her face in soft, ethereal hues. She looked so vulnerable, so innocent. A wave of protectiveness washed over me, fierce and unwavering. I knew what I had to do. I stood up, walked to the window and threw it open. The rain lashed at my face, cold and stinging. The obsidian-eyed man stepped inside, his movements fluid and silent as a shadow. And I smiled, because I knew something he didn't. I wasn't alone. And Sarah, she wasn't sleeping. She was waiting. The wooden stake she held wasn't just any stake. It was a piece of the cross from the Rio Cathedral, blessed by a priest who knew the old ways. A failsafe, prepared during their escape, never spoken of. Always a silent promise between them. As the vampire lunged, Sarah screamed, not in terror, but with the fury of a cornered animal, driving the stake deep into his chest. He withered, crumbling into dust, the rain washing the remnants down the drain, leaving no trace of his visit. Sarah, her eyes blazing, turned to me. "He won't be the last," she said, her voice a low growl. "But we'll be ready." They knew then. Their lives were forever changed, intertwined with a darkness they could never truly escape. They were hunters now, protectors of the innocent, forever vigilant, forever waiting for the next knock on the window. They had a city to save, one vampire at a time.